Timmins James Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's always a great honor to rise and speak on the people of Timmins James Bay, a region that is represented by the great region of Treaty 9. Treaty 9 represents Timmins James Bay and also Kenora region. This is a very profound week for Canadians, the issues that were raised in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I hear from Canadians all over who are deeply moved by what they saw and deeply hurt that this happened in our country and say, how do we move forward? And reconciliation, Mr. Speaker, as Justice Murray Sinclair said, it's not a word, it's rooted in action. Canadians were also shocked and horrified to see the images of elders finding food in a garbage dump in the north and said to themselves, how can this be Canada? Unfortunately, if you travel to many far northern communities, the issue of hunger is a reality. The effect on communities that are not able to feed their children has devastating impacts when you deal with the issues of lack of clean water, when you deal with the lack of proper schools. The issue of hunger underlies it all. So we're talking about a program that was brought in to replace a program that each of these programs have had their merits and each of these programs have had their flaws. We're not arguing about whether a program is perfect or completely imperfect. We're talking about how do we address the needs of people in northern communities. The Auditor General raised serious red flags about the Nutrition North program, that the department had not based community eligibility on need. That's a staggering oversight. That the department had not verified whether the northern retailers had even passed on the full subsidy to customers. That's completely undermining the power of this program. The department had not collected the information needed to manage the Nutrition Canada program or measure its success. And that the department had not implemented the program's cost containment strategy. So the motion today, Mr. Speaker, is about the 50-some other communities that should be part of the program. They're not part of the program. Many of those are in Treaty 9 and Treaty 5 territory in Anishinaabe Nation. We're going to talk about those today. In 2005, one of the first things I was honored to do as a Member of Parliament was to take part in the 100th anniversary celebrations of Treaty 9. Treaty 9 was first signed in they called it Osnaburg House then. It's Mishkigogaming now. And the treaty commissioners, led by the infamous Duncan Campbell Scott, came in to take the rivers along the Albany and then through the Abitibi and the Moose Rivers to sign the Treaty 9 that transferred the greatest wealth in the country in hydro and timber, mining assets and gold and silver to the white settlers. And in exchange, the people were told at Mishkigogaming and Fort Hope and the other communities that their way of life would not be impacted, but that wasn't what happened. What happened was that the people were taken and put on these internal displacement camps. That's what the reserves were. They were forced into these internal displacement camps, and if you go into Casablanca, if you go into Pakanjikam, if you go into Kashechewan today, they are still internal displacement camps where people do not have the power to affect the change in their community because they're still under the Indian Act. So I went with the recreation of this historic trip, and I was there in Mishkigogaming, I was there at Martin Falls, I was there at Moose Factory at the fort where they recreated the signing of the treaties. And I was at Martin Falls, and a man stood up and he spoke in Ojibwe and he apologized for not speaking English. He said, I never learned English properly. When they came and took my sister to the residential school, she never came home. Ever. And nobody bothered to come back and say what happened to her. So when they came the next year, his family hid this man in the bush. And I see in Martin Falls the crushing poverty, the lack of water, that this government would spend $2 million a year shipping bottled water into a community rather than fix the water plant when there's letter after letter from the community saying, help us fix this water plant. And I had to stand up and speak, and they were all talking about the commemoration. They were all talking about, let's commemorate, and we had the government officials there. And the question was obvious. What's there to celebrate with the signing of Treaty 9? Where so much wealth was transferred away from the original signatories of the treaty, and they were left in such deplorable conditions that continue today. So how does this affect what we're talking about now? Well, Mr. Speaker, I've been taught by the people of James Bay and the other communities I represent, and unless you know the history, you don't really understand why we're here. So we'll talk about Mishkikogaming, where I was when they signed the treaty, a place that has faced crushing levels of poverty, where the issues of Nutrition North are absolutely central to the crisis that's facing their community. The other community of Webakwe, where in 2007, international relief agencies went into Webakwe and Mishkikogaming that Free the Children, or Save the Children International went in to see, and they were shocked. They couldn't believe that in North America they saw this kind of poverty. Nicholas Finney from Save the Children in the UK said that this was an international humanitarian disaster zone. He said, quote, "There's been no sudden disaster here. It is a gradual disaster that has emerged, unfolded, and been propagated, whether intentionally or by negligence, by the people that should have known better, by people in power." Feed the Children in Oklahoma responded by sending 100,000 pounds of food to help those communities. And this carries on today. I look at Martin Falls and Webakwe that are not part of Nutrition North, that don't have clean water, and they just happen to be in the heart of the Ring of Fire. And I hear this government say how the Ring of Fire, oh, it's going to be a great thing. We even had a minister for a while. I think the minister disappeared. I think we had two ministers who were going to, we were all going to benefit from the Ring of Fire, i.e., yeah, everybody else but the people of Webakwe and Martin Falls were going to benefit. And we can't wait to get this off the ground. And meanwhile, the people didn't have access to proper food. Meanwhile, they're having to rely on bottled water that's being shipped in, not enough to keep them safe. So, Mr. Speaker, we carry on to this day of a broken promise that was made when that treaty was signed. Today, in Fort Albany, it's $60 for baby formula. 2 pounds of frozen beef is $15.99. In Treaty 5 in Barrens Hills, people live on $371 a month in welfare and pay $6 for bread, $13 for a jug of milk, $37 for a case of eggs. If they want their children to have something fresh like grapes, well, that's $12. If you ever saw cherries in those communities, that'd cost you $20. So people feed their children chips and pop because it's easier. And this isn't to say people are lazy. These are people who still live on the land. But we're seeing the disappearance of the caribou herds in the north because of industrial development. There's something that is absolutely one of the greatest things I've ever seen, which is to fly over James Bay in winter and see a mass caribou herd running on the ice below. Well, those caribou herds are starting to disappear. And we heard the minister from Nunavut who talked about all the people who they worked out on the land. And you talk to the families about how difficult it is to get out on the land now because of the costs. We need to find alternative measures. And there's not to say again that there aren't really good ideas happening in Fort Albany. We have an incredible greenhouse operation that's come up. In Attawapiskat, they started the farmers market where they actually fly in fresh produce for the families. There are good models out there. But we need to deal with this fundamental issue of hunger. I just want to say, Mr. Speaker, that we've seen a failure from this government, a refusal to stand up for their communities. Like in the Kenora region, Cat Lake, Deer Lake, Casablanca Lake, Keewatin, Kingfisher Lake, Couchiching, McDowell Lake, Neskatanga, North Spirit Lake, Pakanjikam, Poplar Hill, Sajiko Lake, Sandy Hill, Slate Hills, Wagakeka, Wawakagegan, Webakwe, as I mentioned, Martin Falls, Pewanak, even Moosonee is attached by the rail line. The costs of food are extraordinary. We need to do better in this House. These are the Canadian citizens. We are a land of the North. Everyone in this country should be able to go put their children to bed at night and know that they're not going to go to bed hungry.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaires. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for his question and for his passion for the people that he represents. I did have a question. I've noted in the list that the NDP, of the list of communities, there's two in his riding, I believe, Moosonee and Weenusk. Apologies for the pronunciation there. I have in my notes here that Moosonee has year-round rail access and that Weenusk actually does receive the subsidy, but under the name of Peewanuck. So I guess perhaps the member can address those two questions on the eligibility list, but also again, we're hearing in speech after speech from the NDP that the motion is one thing, but they actually want to expand Nutrition North's eligibility to all northern communities, all communities that are experiencing high food costs. And while that may be a laudable goal, I don't think that the analysis on the cost of that has been done. So perhaps the member could share what he believes that cost would be, and to perhaps address those two communities that I mentioned, which would seem to fall outside of the NDP motion as it's drafted.
The honourable member for Timmins, James Bay.
Thank you. I would like to interpret from my honourable colleague that they share our desire to make sure that no community lives in hunger, whether they're on the list or not. That this motion is talking about the 50 isolated communities that are not receiving the adequate subsidy. That's clear. The fact that there are other communities in difficult situations is something that we as a parliament need to talk about. The issue of Moosonee is available by rail line, but it is a very difficult issue to live there in terms of feeding families. So I would like to go back and forth and barter with my colleagues on the other side about how we can improve this. But the overall principle should be that we can do better in this country when they can spend $135 million on bogus television ads and they can't spend $7 million making sure that people have access to baby food. We have a problem, and we need to fix it.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The honourable member for Abitibi Bay James Nunavik AU.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm absolutely astonished sometimes by the way in which this kind of issue is dealt with. It's such a basic and such an important issue. The parliamentary secretary has just stood again, I don't know how many times he's risen in this debate, and asked how much this would cost. I would like to know from my colleague from Timmins James Bay, it's true, this kind of question has to be asked, but one of the questions that I would like to have answered by this government since I've been here is how much have they spent every year to fight against the rights of Aboriginal peoples before the courts every year. I think it's over $300 million a year that they fight against the fundamental rights of the peoples, the founding peoples of this country. Is this on the base? Is it on this basis that we have to discuss this, or is it on the basis of the needs of the First Nations of this country and the needs that they have across the country? That's why it's important to have the eligibility criteria as part of today's motion to see how we can help more. So I wouldn't know if he can comment on that.
James Bay.
Well, thank you. I want to thank my honourable colleague. When we're talking about children who are hungry in this House, we hear the Ebenezer Scrooge line, I want to know every penny and what's it going to cost our taxpayer. But when it comes to paying lawyers to fight the residential school survivors at St. Anne's, to fight Cindy Blackstock, to fight children getting proper medical treatment because they're Indigenous, money's no option. Money is no option. They spend double going after First Nation communities and First Nation rights on legal fees, and they go after international tax frauds. They spend more than they do on RCMP investigations in taking to court. This is what's spent over $100 to $300 million a year fighting First Nation rights, and yet when we talk about alleviating hunger, they want it costed down right to the last penny. It shows the fundamental insincerity.